You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. And today we've got one specifically really aimed at teachers, though people who practice a lot might be interested, but really aimed at the art of teaching. And this one's going to be more conversational. And we're going to take it from a question that came up in one of our office hours. And I think it's a great question that probably a lot of our teachers and other teachers, and really, I think this information that we talk about could apply to any teacher training you do, but really, how do I take that information from a teacher training, whatever training that is, with us or with someone else? We come home, I know, from our yoga medicine teacher trainings with just a ton of information and a ton of tools. And I think for a lot of people that can be overwhelming. For all of us, it's overwhelming. I know for me, myself, it's overwhelming as well to go to a training and learn a lot of information. And so it's, a nice kind of conversational episode really on how do I take all these tools and make it into something meaningful for my students. And so the question, actually, just so that you have a little context, was from, again, one of our teachers in one of our trainings that said, I've done MFR and female health and yin, and I'm about to do the shoulder training. When I finished MFR, I felt like I could use it for my classes. Same with women's health, female health. But I'm having a hard time combining now all of these as this person layers more and more trainings. The question is, how do I teach genuinely? Should I focus on one thing instead of doing it all? And so I think this takes us into a lot of good conversations. Yeah.
It's such a good question because it's such an essential question that teachers face. I almost feel like your first training, wherever you do it, is the easiest because you come out of it with the idea of, well, this is how yoga is. And I just have to teach this way because now I know how yoga is and I know how yoga is taught. But the more trainings you do, the more information you gain, the more tools you've got in your toolkit, the more skills you have, the less clarity you feel, in the sense that it's no longer, this is how we do it, this is how it is, but I've got this option, this option, this option. I could do the pose this way. I could do it this way. I could use this prop. I could use the wall. I could focus on the shoulder. I could focus on the hip. So all of a sudden, you've got so many more options to choose from that it almost becomes paralyzing at times to figure out how to communicate it to students in a way that it lands as powerfully with them as it did for you.
I love that too, because, and I think especially somewhat in yoga medicine trainings, but even more so in some other trainings where it's very cookie cutter, where it's like you can leave feeling that sense of security in just having a set sequence or a set thing to do. And then I think that the issues come later on when you realize that one size doesn't fit everyone. However, even for our trainings, there's always pros and cons, right? There's always a learning curve. With us, it's really teaching you how to understand the body and how to apply it to the individual. And really, our trainings are aimed at helping you work one-on-one, but there's so many takeaways that come from that apply to a group class. So then it's like, how do I integrate this, especially as you've done several of those trainings and you have so much that you want to give your students? And so I think you and I can both agree that the first answer is really easy, and that really you have to keep it simple. And this person in this question kind of answered that. They were like, okay, I did the MFR and I felt like I had a lot to use for my classes. I did another one and I felt like a lot of female health and I had a lot for my classes. And so the first thing I would say is do that for each of them. Like when you do a training, any training, when you come home, just focus on that content for a while. And even you do the shoulder training, any one of our trainings, and there's a ton of different topics. You might even pick one place to start, whatever stands out. Maybe it's just the rotator cuff in general, or maybe it's rotation of the shoulder, or specific concepts or alignment cues. I mean, I know we look at it from a lot of different angles, but I would just pick a place to start and take some time going through the shoulder. I think the beauty of this is that even for those people who don't have shoulder issues, what you're doing is teaching them how to move their body intelligently. And, not that there's a right or wrong way to do that, but teaching them how to kind of understand the inner workings of their body, how to move more efficiently, how to hopefully minimize or avoid injuries or issues in the future. And so I think everyone appreciates it, even though maybe only a small portion of your class has shoulder issues per se.
I agree. And I think when you're really living in an area of content for a period of time in your own practice, you start to find different ways to use it. And when you then translate that into teaching your students, you'll have a different experience from the one that you had at the training, because teaching content to a room full of teachers is often quite different to teaching content to a room full of non-teachers. And so you'll find probably other challenges come up, and you might need to approach it slightly differently, or explain different foundational things first, or offer different options. And so to me, there's a really important translation process of, here's all of the stuff I learned at the training. Here's how I feel it and experience it and benefit from it in my own practice. And then here's how that translates to the human beings that I teach in my community. And all of those things are likely to have a little shift in focus and emphasis and application.
Right. And I think it's also, I mean, we in our trainings have teachers from all around the world. And I think it's also sometimes a language issue too, that certain words don't land the same in every community around the world. And so you also have to then find, because we tend to use our words and ways of saying things that are very kind of iconic in yoga medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And you also then have to translate that to what's meaningful to you. Yeah. And I think sometimes it can be really interesting to go home and do a workshop, like especially with something like MFR, female health. I think these are great areas to have a little deeper investigation. And so perhaps a bunch of your students end up coming and are more familiar with that. And so I can start to layer in that information in different ways. I think students really appreciate that, but I do have to like give it some time to simmer, both with your community as well as with yourself. You've done this training. When I first started teaching, for the first 10 years I was teaching or so, I was dedicated to doing one teacher training a year. I was still in school at the time, so it was usually in the summer, and or through not all of those 10 years, but through some of them. And so I would go to a teacher training. I would save up all year, go to a teacher training in the summer, and then spend the year really chewing on all my notes and all the information, and picking a muscle or a pose or something to focus on for that week or that month, and really getting to know it in my own practice, really getting to know it in my teaching. And I think that's the intimacy that you want to develop before you try and merge all this content, because the merging will kind of come naturally once you become really acclimated to the information, and your students too, right? You go home and you just try and download all this information on them, and as well as all the other information you have, and it's not going to land well, or stick with them.
I've definitely had, well, firstly, yes, the experience of taking time between trainings is, I think, a little bit more usual pre-COVID than during COVID, because all of a sudden so many things became available online that I think for a lot of us, the pace of training kind of picked up. We were like, oh, I can do this now. I can do this now. I can do this now. Whereas previously it just took time to save up the money and organize the time away and then go home and really digest the content. So I do think more people right now are sitting with 4 different buckets of content that they need to try to reconcile than they probably did previously. But I've definitely had that experience of coming home from a training jam-packed full of information and just bubbling over with the enthusiasm of wanting to share it all. And I remember vividly one class pretty early on in my teaching where I had them in a pose and I'm talking through all of the new techniques that I'd learned and the things that I wanted them to feel and remember. And somebody in the class, another teacher, called out, "Just shut up and get us moving." And it was, heartbreaking, but not untrue.
That is, wow. I can't, as a teacher, that kind of breaks my heart. Like,
It did. As I said, it was heartbreaking, but also she was not wrong. I had them in extended side angle for a long period of time, and that's not what they signed up for. They didn't come to learn everything about the hip in this pose. They had come to move their bodies. So it painful lessons are sometimes the ones that stick with you, and that one has stuck with me.
Well, and I think you draw the people to you, hopefully, that appreciate that. I don't know the context of that situation, but like some people have expectations for a quota of chaturangas. Those people don't come to my classes, or a quota of inversions. I'm assuming the same for you too. And so, to assume that one person's subjective experience is the same as another is kind of crazy, for that person. And I mean, I don't know what the context was, but like, I would never speak up in a class because I think, who knows what the teacher's normal flow is. And maybe that's what the other people like. Who am I to assume that everyone wants to move more? And maybe some people aren't enjoying the information and holding things and, really dissecting it. I think as a teacher, you do want to have some expectations set and met in the description and in what you do about what they can, expect. And maybe I think over the years nowadays, mine is more that people will expect something interesting and informative, maybe therapeutic. But I think previously over the years, it was more like, okay, you're going to expect a certain level of movement and a certain level of introspection or information, or even just something that's really purposeful. But I think them knowing that they're always going to kind of get that on some level, whether that's like there's always a certain amount of each part of the class, or there's always a certain amount of talking, or there's always a certain amount of activity. I don't know, whatever it is. I think there needs to be some expectation, some continuity of any sort.
Yeah, I guess the point that I took away from that experience was that when we're new to teaching something, whether it's a set of information or a particular tool or technique or approach for a pose, it can be a little bit clunky until we become more polished and more practiced. And so
Yeah.
these days I tend to spend a bit more time living with things in my own practice first. And then when I do start to teach them, I might start one-on-one so that there's more room for interaction. I pick a student that I think it will be particularly beneficial for, and I get to troubleshoot and work through miscommunications and questions and modifications and options and all of that sort of stuff, so that when I do start to teach it to a group, I've overcome some of that clunkiness and the process flows a little more smoothly, and I'm able to signal in advance. Some people are more tender here than others, so you might like to grab a blanket to pad the, yada, yada, or you could try turning it down to its flattest height. I'm a little bit more ready to handle the things that come up quickly. I'm more efficient at teaching it. And that does, I think, take a bit of time. And it's why you can't just come straight from a training and download it to your students, because you're just kind of parroting what you remember of what you've heard with no translation into this is how it feels for me, and this is how it's likely to land with you. So there is a process of learning to teach that more efficiently that you don't want to rush.
Yeah. And I think even once you do start teaching it in your group classes, there's still going to be a learning curve of watching how it lands with people, because now you've got even more bodies. But I agree. I think it's great to start in your own practice, transition it to one-on-ones, then start, drip feeding it into your group classes and layering concepts over time. I mean, I think what's most important is to start with really simple things and weave it into what your normal flow might look like, whatever that is, or whatever your normal class of any sort might look like. And then let that be something meaningful to them. I think by the time you end a training, the depth of knowledge is so great that sometimes it's hard to go back. I hear this over and over and really make it simple and go like, oh, that seems too simple then, right? But really, really, really simplifying it. And I hear this all the time in our case study presentations for our therapeutic specialists, is like, there's always these main takeaways from the case studies, and simplicity is always one. I think we all hear that all the time, but once you start applying this and working one-on-one, you can never overestimate how important the simplicity is. But I think the reason we train our teachers to that great depth of knowledge is so that then you can be able to adapt and modify and educate and inform your students, which is really what takes that deeper knowledge, is answering the questions and also creating succinct bite-sized pieces of information in a yoga class, like you said, so you're not leaving an extended side angle for 5 minutes. So,
I think the kind of undercurrent from what you're saying there is you can't come back from a myofascial release training and turn your Hatha Vinyasa class into a myofascial class. It still has to meet the expectations that people have of, like you said, a certain amount of talking, a certain amount of moving, a certain amount of time on the floor. It still has to follow the general trajectory of the class that your students are used to and that it's stated on the class description. And that in itself kind of forces you to keep things simple. So if you're going to introduce a myofascial release technique into a class like that, it really can only be one, and it can really only be fairly short. It's either preparing them for the next part of class or helping them wind down from the previous part of class. And that requires a real patience to think about investing time in teaching these techniques to students, to just drop one in here, come back next week, drop in one more, or even repeat the same one to give them another taste at it from another perspective, and just trust that your students will build up the same depth of knowledge that you now have, but only over time, not all today in this one class. But for those who come back, there'll be another little nugget, there'll be another juicy little seed of information. And over time, that builds up to really powerful tools that they'll have in their toolkit.
Right. I mean, absolutely. And then the other thing I would say as a teacher is that what I'm always thinking about too is I'm thinking about teaching and creating my classes for the people who come back, but I'm also always trying to make sure I'm prepared to make all of that accessible for the new people who will come too. So my investment is really in those people who come back. So I say that because what I'm thinking about here is, okay, I'll plant this seed today, this awareness of the shoulder and how the shoulder moves. And maybe I'll take a minute or two at the beginning or somewhere in the middle to just break that down. A minute or two goes really fast. You don't want to be doing a lot of talking. Usually most people are there to experience. And then, the next time I'll layer this little thing in, and maybe that thing is all week, all week concept, and then the next week is another thing. And then the next week is another thing. I think that's really important, because then I'm thinking about those people who come back eventually will have all these things. So again, it takes away that need to download. They need to know all of this. I mean, and the shoulder's a great example too, because, it's really easy, especially once you've done the shoulder training, to come back and be have a really hard time watching chaturangas, and you can't, fix everyone's chaturanga. And I use fix with quotes. I think we can do chaturanga a lot of different ways, and we can also do it in what one might consider really poor alignment for a long time and be fine. So I do have to be okay with that. Our body is resilient. It's made to adapt to stress and load that we apply to it. The key though is that, the things that we're doing most often, we want to optimize. So chaturanga is a great one to just be okay with slowly working on it over time. And again, I'm investing in the people who come back, really.
Yeah, and I think this came up on the sequencing office hours call recently too, is for me, what really helps me spread the information out and be patient and just plant one seed at a time is that I might plan my curriculum in advance. If I've just done the shoulder training as our example, I might plan content out over the next few weeks of, this week the focus is going to be the posterior shoulder. And then a couple of weeks later, we'll talk about a central position for weight bearing. And then a couple of weeks later, we'll talk about, and on and on and on. I don't have to tell students that it's a class series. I don't need to tell them we're going to spend the next 6 weeks working through all of the content from my shoulder training. And I'm certainly also going to be talking about hips and feet and necks and, breathing and whatever other stuff comes up. But it just gives me a sense that I'm going to be feeding this information out, drip feeding it over time in a way that's really logical. That means that each time I show up to teach, I have a clear singular intention, and I'm not trying to do everything. I'm not trying to teach every nuance of alignment and every single technique. Today, I'm just focusing on the posterior shoulder, and I'm picking the tools, the techniques, the poses, the variations that make the most sense to drive that experience home. And for today, that's plenty. And next week, we'll take some of that information and layer on. And for the people that weren't here for this week, that's okay. There'll be a fresh focus. There'll be new information for them to pick up. But for the people who were there, there'll be some familiar muscles or some familiar actions that they can then add into whatever I'm teaching next. So just being willing to develop the curriculum over time, for me at least, helps me have clarity in each individual class, and it makes me slow down and take a breath and be content to just share this one piece today and trust that for the people for whom it's helpful, it will land. For the people for whom it isn't, well, they're still moving their legs and stretching their hips and, standing, balancing and releasing their neck and breathing and all the good things.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, there's a lot of different ways to do that. I love this. We talked about workshopping things. We talked about just picking something and picking, little pieces at a time. You could be planful and create a series, even though it doesn't necessarily need to be a series they sign up for. It could just be a series in your mind where basically you're kind of planning all of that out. Either way, what we're trying to do is kind of drip feed the content to them so that it's digestible and also purposeful. I mean, we've talked about this on here quite a bit already, as on the Yoga Medicine podcast. I think you and me, Rachel, about teaching with purpose. And that purpose can be a lot of different things. It could be a million things. It could be calves, but we all have calves, which is great, even though not everyone has problems with their calves, but we can all relate to that, right? And so, I think the interesting part of the purpose is finding things that we can all relate to. There's a lot of philosophical themes that we can all relate to, but that can keep that central piece of clarity in your classes. And then as a way to kind of take this training info and make it relevant to your students by getting really clear on these precise points. And, like I said before, teaching that owner's manual to the body piece by piece, and being patient.
Yeah, and
letting it come over time.
One thing that came up for me in answering this question was that some tools and techniques to me also fit better with some class styles than others. So with myofascial release, for example, you can use a yoga block and do a few techniques pretty easily. But if you want to use a yoga block and a foam roller and a big soft rad center and some recovery rounds, then probably a hatha vinyasa class isn't the best place to do that. You don't want to have people gather up, assuming you have them, 8 different props, use each one for 10 seconds, and then still try to find time for standing flow. So if you're going to use a bunch of different tools, that probably to me would belong more to a dedicated myofascial release class or a yin and myofascial release class. If it's something that involves 4 blankets and 2 bolsters and a block, then again, it's something I would probably use in a restorative class as opposed to trying to have people gather and assemble and position all of those props during a hatha vinyasa class. So for me too, just knowing the technique doesn't mean that I use it in every single class style. I try to make the technique appropriate to, the amount of time we're likely to have, the mood that people have likely come with, the number of props that they're going to want to get, even assuming we have access to them. So yeah, there's also some patience in that. This is a technique that I might use in a workshop, but outside of a workshop, I'm probably just going to use in a restorative class, for example.
Yeah, and I think bringing it back full circle to the question, because what we've talked about now is bringing each of these trainings in, which was kind of the answer to the question originally. But the question really was about how do I use all of this information, as a student who's done several trainings with us. And, for those of you listening, that might also be non-yoga medicine trainings. I know a lot of teachers will take maybe a variety of trainings, whether that's with us or with someone else. That could be more orthopedic trainings, shoulder, hip, and spine. That could be more MFR or yin or lymphatics or pranayama. And I would say, in a group class, what we've already mentioned is having a clear purpose, I think, is really key. Otherwise, you're just going to overwhelm your students. However, like there could be a place for the class when you just feel like you need it all. I think I just did one recently, like when you need it all, where maybe it is a bunch of your favorite things that just feel good things, and feel good could be the theme as well. I think there's a clarity and sense of purpose in that as well. Obviously, like Rachel said, you might be spending time doing more myofascial release than anything else, in which case it might not be a flow class anymore. But it can be really challenging, I think, to pull all of it into one class. And so the reason that we have all of these trainings in yoga medicine, and the reason why I think you should continue doing trainings of any sort, is that in one training, we can only go so deep. And, what happens is we just start to see one part of this person. And as we start to do more of these trainings and look at more of the different layers, our mental health, our physiological health, our physical body, our spiritual body, whatever the context may be, we start to get a better view of this whole 3D view of the person we're working with, which becomes really important when we're working one-on-one therapeutically. And I see this over and over and over again in our case study presentations from our therapeutic specialists, is like they go in for an orthopedic concern and they apply, they do the evaluation and they apply all these great techniques. And, sometimes that works and sometimes that's great. And sometimes what we see is what they really needed was nervous system tuning, or maybe the MFR was the big thing that was helpful, or maybe it was really the questions they asked and the mental perspective that they were taking, or their relationship to pain. I think there's so many different reasons, or things to look at to create balance in the people we're working with, which, in a group class, we just can't get to. And that's why I think my investment in the person who comes back is important, because, one day we'll have a theme that's more focused maybe on mental perspective or philosophy, or, how we see ourselves, or some other thing that might be relevant for them. And then I can have a purposeful interaction with that. And, it's an opportunity too at the end of class when students come in, they're like, wow, that was amazing. That was so helpful. And it's like, great. Well, if there's anything that you can cue in on that was most helpful, was there anything that you could cue in on? And if they're like, yeah, this thing you did right here, and like, great. If it was MFR, maybe they can add that into their day now. Or if it was a specific alignment technique or cue, then they can bring that into other classes. I just want to find ways for the things that were helpful that they can reconnect to, so that then they can optimize their own body as well. So
yeah, repetition is key. That was something that I really did want to mention today, that if you do really want to teach students techniques that they can benefit from, it won't be once in a class every 6 months. It will be something that you've taught them often enough that they remember, or that you had a conversation with them about after class and talked through, so that they haven't just done it that once and then not again until you happen to teach it again. But it's, as you said, something that they're now doing through their day or in their home practice or in every class if it felt really helpful. And I do think that the advice we've given today generally around group classes actually applies for individuals too, because even though the more you learn, the more layers of an individual student you're likely to be able to see, they still came to you with a chief complaint. And so that has to be your guiding purpose. And maybe as you're working with them on, say it was shoulder pain that they came with, you discover that it's the nervous system stuff that they're really responding to. You're still coming at it from the perspective of the shoulder. So even though the techniques that you use might shift a little bit, you might spend a little bit more time at the beginning in breath work or meditation or visualization or myofascial release to downregulate the nervous system, and then move on to some more, strengthening or orthopedic moves or alignment-based practices, and then into some more nervous system downregulation at the end. You're still being driven by that clarity of purpose. The reason that they got you was shoulder pain, and you're not trying to, in inverted commas, fix everything, unless you together agree that your focus needs to shift and now the shoulder is less important and their stress levels or their breathing has become more important. So that clarity of purpose still, I think, really needs to drive you.
right. And I mean, for example, we just had a case study recently where someone and this is just one of many examples, but an obvious one where the person had very specific pain going up in their knee, going upstairs, and what looked so clearly mechanical. And she did exactly what I would have done, which is starting with really the alignment-based practices and some MFR. And this person was doing all the things, and it wasn't really changing. And it looked like, and this happens in a lot of different contexts and different ways where things look so clear and obvious. And a lot of times that works. We apply those techniques that we know and it works. And then sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, this person, when you look in a little bit more at the evaluation, was really stressed, overworked, had a lot going on. I think if I remember correctly, some, you know, a lot emotionally as well as work. And so maybe halfway through the 8 sessions that she was doing for a case study or so, they started doing more restorative. And sure enough, just a couple sessions later, which isn't always the case, right? For a lot of us, I think this person might have had some yoga experience. For a lot of people, it can take a while just to get into relaxing and to restorative, but it happens over and over. And I would say at least, we do 9 of these case studies in each meeting that we have. And I would say there's always at least 1 or 2 that look really clearly mechanical that end up being nervous system related. And so, like you said, you go through the natural process, even in a one-on-one scenario. We start with what seems most obvious to us. We work with the physical layers or the techniques that feel like they'll be most helpful from your experience or your training. And then we start to brainstorm other things and we start to remember, oh yeah, we've got all these other layers of this person. Like, maybe it's really the stress that's really driving this and the communication system, even though it seems very mechanical. So, I just think what you're saying, whether it's a group class or one-on-one, I do have to have somewhat of a focus, but I think layering those things in, even if the nervous system wasn't the most important thing for that person, they have another tool in their toolbox that, they can come back to as well, just as in the group class scenario. So
I
all
think we,
all good all around.
yeah. And I think we've kind of come full circle to clarity of purpose is really key because that's what drives simplicity. And that's where we started. The question was, do I really try to do one thing or do I try to do it all? Well, you really need to try to do just one thing at a time. So simplicity comes from clarity of purpose. And then repetition, whether you're repeating the tools and techniques that you think will be the most helpful over time, or whether you're teaching the students so that they can repeat them, they'll get the most benefit from the things that they do the most often. And patience, I think, was the other theme that came out again and again and again. You can do it all, but you can't do it all today with this group of people right now in this class. You've got to be willing to plant seeds and give them time to flourish. Circle back next week, add another little piece of information, and so on.
Yeah, and I think also along all of those lines, that was a great summary, is also just looking at that 3-dimensional layer, the 3-dimensionality of the people we work with, whether that be in group classes and, varying our themes, whether that be in a one-on-one practice. And that can be in your own way. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to force philosophical themes if those aren't natural to you, but maybe it's, asking questions or finding different ways to relate to the other layers of their being, even if it's just in small ways. Maybe it's still a physically driven, theme with little questions along the way. I do think, it's just so important, especially if our goal is having a therapeutic outcome, which would be more of a one-on-one scenario. And to me, therapeutics just mean it's individualized. But if our goal is to have a therapeutic outcome, individualized to the person we're working with, we really have to look at that 3D approach, of looking at the layers of this person. So a lot of great reminders here, hopefully beneficial to those of you working one-on-one, those of you doing group classes or both. And, I think these are also concepts that just keep coming back on our case study calls. Rachel, you're on those a lot of times too. And, these are really common themes I think our therapeutic specialists see in the work that they're doing one-on-one out there as well. So some great reminders.
Yeah, give it time. Give it time for the content to land in your own practice. Give it time for you to become more efficient at teaching it, and give it time for it to really land with your students. Patience.
Simple, repeat, patience. Yeah. And, I think it takes a lot of the weight off our shoulders as teachers too, to feel like we need to do it all. So hopefully it gives you a little bit of clarity and a little bit of freedom in your teachings and a little bit of inspiration as you head back out into your week and your work. And to those listening, just a thank you for all you do. I think our yoga teachers are out there doing the hard work and supporting their communities. So I hope you enjoy putting this information to good use. Thank you.
Love it.
We'll see you next
Thank you.
time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.